So, welcome to the Culture Bumpkin. I am again with everyone's favorite Brit, Charlie Robinson.
The one back again.
We had such a good time on talking. What did we talk about?
We talked about the
Balaclava.
Battle of Balaclava, the Crimean War, and why British cavalry is the best and most bravest in the world.
That's right. And had a great time. He talked probably for an hour without saying or taking a breath. He knows his stuff, and I like that. So I was like, let's talk the War of the Roses. But first, we're going to start off with a piece of literature set in that time period, which is Shakespeare's Richard III. So here is Act 1, Scene 1, breaking the fourth wall, out comes the villain, and scene, or action.
Now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by the sun of York, and all the clouds that lowered upon our house. In the deep bosom of the ocean buried, now are our brows bound with victorious wreaths, our bruised arms hung up for monuments, our stern alarums changed to merry meetings, our dreadful marches to delightful measures. Grim-visaged war has smoothed his wrinkled front. And now, instead of mouthing barded steeds to fright the souls of fearful adversaries, he capers nimbly in a lady's chamber to the lascivious pleasing of a lute. But I, that am not shaped for sportive tricks, nor made to court an amorous looking glass, I, that am rudely stamped and want love's majesty, to strut before a wanton, ambling nymph, I, that am curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of feature by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time, into this breathing world scarce half made up, and that's so lamely and unfashionable that dogs bark at me as I halt by them. Why I, this weak piping time of peace, have no delight to pass away the time, unless to spy my shadow in the sun and descant on mine own deformity, and therefore, since I cannot prove a loser, to entertain these fair, well-spoken days, I am determined to prove a villain, and hate the idle pleasures of these days. Plots have I laid, inductions dangerous, by drunken prophecies, libels, and dreams, to set my brother Clarence and the king in deadly hate the one against the other, and if King Edward be as true and just as I am subtle, false, and treacherous, this day should Clarence closely be mewed up. About a prophecy which says that, of Edward's heirs the murderer shall be, dive thoughts down to my soul. Here, Clarence comes.
Thank you. That's great. So, obviously, that is Richard III, or the guy that would become Richard III, or whatever. What was the setting? What was the context of that?
So, Richard III fought extensively in, and then eventually became the main leader of the Yorkist side in the Wars of the Roses. These were effectively a English civil war. So when people will refer to the English Civil War, it will be the one between the parliamentarians and Charles I in the mid-1600s. The reason why I think the Wars of the Roses, although we may well class it as a civil war, isn't sort of written as and considered as such in sort of the popular memory is because in the High Middle Ages, and certainly even more commonly before, a king effectively warring against his barons and lords was part and parcel of politics. So nowadays we may well have a vote of no confidence in Parliament, where if you have the opposition parties showing discontent for the king and they feel that even not the king, the prime minister, if the opposition parties in modern politics might feel that they have a certain amount of discontent against the prime minister, and they may also feel that some MPs in his own party might support their grievances, they may call a vote of no confidence, and if they win, it forces an election. In the High Middle Ages and before, that vote of no confidence was a lord that might have a grievance with the king or challenges his legitimacy to be king, will exercise his grievance by mustering his forces to a field, and instead of a vote of no confidence in Parliament, the vote is effectively whether or not the monarch can coerce or encourage more lords to muster to his side on the field than the egregious rebel, in quotes, lord.
So would Richard III be considered a rebel? Or was
It depends who you ask and at what time. At the Battle of Bosworth Field, which was when he was killed, he was certainly the king, and it was Henry Tudor that was the rebel.
So Henry VII?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So the Wars of the Roses started in the mid-1450s. At the end of the Hundred Years' War, I believe it's Henry VI was a king who had come to power, had inherited the crown as a minor after his father, Henry V, had been a bit of a wetter and died of disease before he could consolidate his war gains in the Hundred Years' War. And as a result, Henry VI's kingdom was effectively governed by half incompetent, half corrupt advisors and protectors, and in combination with their incompetence and a general sort of war exhaustion or lack of incentives for lords to back the crown in the war with France, led to us effectively losing the war, relinquishing our claim to the crown of France. And so in the wake of this, you had a king who had effectively been mollycoddled his entire adult life, or early adult life, had been surrounded by people who knew more than him or professed to, and didn't really learn his own way. And it's said that he was quite a sort of, depends who you ask, mad on one side of the spectrum, or just a bit sort of weird on one side of the spectrum. But either way, he was not a sort of calm and consolidated monarch. He was quite erratic and not a very good king, basically. And so there began a rebellion where the Yorkist faction, who through their connections, however far back through the royal family tree, claimed that they and their dynasty was the rightful ruling dynasty of England. And so this erupted in, I think, 1455 in the Midlands, where it started as a sort of a rebellion. I put rebellion in quotes because saying that in a modern context makes it seem like it's falling over this massive precipice. But it's important to remember that mustering your armies to a field, although it was quite a strong message, was not out of the ordinary. And also it's important to remember that just because you muster your men and you march in a field doesn't mean you've declared civil war or declared war on anyone. It's oftentimes it could have just been a way to show the king that I mean business. If you don't address my grievances, then, this is what I can do.
Right.
And depending on how powerful you appear to be, he might say, well, sod off, my army's 8 times the size of yours, I'll crush you like a bug. Or he might say, oh Christ, these rebels are pretty powerful, I'll do what they say. Or he might say, I could probably beat them, but it might be a bit costly, so maybe a little bit of gentle reform is in order. It was quite common. Magna Carta is the more extreme ends, where the barons rebelled against King John and forced him to sign what effectively became the first part of the English Constitution. But barons or lords rising against their king was not uncommon in the Middle Ages. But anyway, so the name of the field that they met on escapes me. However, the Yorkist faction and their allies mustered their forces to sort of show their grievances to Henry VI and his incompetent ministers, and it devolved into a battle, and I believe Henry VI was captured. And basically what followed was a series of back and forth as the sort of conflict escalated, people got entrenched in their positions, and what started as a sort of faction of aggrieved lords developed very quickly into a faction of a dynastic challenge to the throne, as opposed to a sort of rebellion to force better government. And there was quite a back and forth between the 1450s and the 1480s. After the Battle of Tewkesbury, in I think the early 1480s, the Yorkists came out on top. Basically, there would be every 5 years or so there would be a major battle, and either the Lancastrian or Yorkist, whoever lost the battle would their current claimant, the most recent alive one, because it would often be that one would get killed in the battle, and then the next would then be the leader of the Yorkist or Lancastrian cause. Basically, each time one of them lost a battle, they would bugger off to France or the Low Countries, lay low for a couple of years, and then come back, being funded by either the French king or Burgundian merchants, and then reclaim the throne.
It would be like in their best interest to probably keep England divided, but also have
absolutely.
Like, I've got a friend and we'll have commerce and stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was sort of it could be for any reason. Like for the French doing it, it will be because just sowing discontent in England will benefit them, whatever happens. Whereas for Burgundian merchants, it might be, if we help this guy, then he'll give us a nice trade deal on the English wool trade, kind of thing. Yeah. But so that's exactly what Richard III did, as in support of his brother, Edward IV, I believe. Edward IV. And he supported his brother to win the Battle of Tewkesbury, which they did, and the Yorkists were ascendant. And the only Lancastrian claimant that remained was Henry Tudor. And by this point, his claim to the throne was rather tenuous. It was several generations back through the illegitimate child, or what the Yorkists claimed to be an illegitimate child, of John of Gaunt, who was related to Edward III. So it was really quite a tenuous link. If you ask me, I think the Yorkists did probably have a stronger dynastic claim to the throne by the time that Henry Tudor was the only Lancastrian claimant. Henry VI, for example, a Lancastrian, had a very, very strong claim because he was king, his father was king, but Henry Tudor, not so much. He was a sort of a distant cousin of the Lancastrian kings. But so the Yorkists won the Battle of Tewkesbury. Edward IV was proclaimed king, and he had two sons. And Richard III, who had spent several years, helping his family in these campaigns, and especially in separate campaigns against Scotland, he had in these sorts of low-intensity raids and counter-raids on the borderlands in Scotland, had sort of cut his teeth as a military commander, administrator, and lord-to-be ruler. And when his brother died, the rightful heir was his eldest son, and then after that, his second son. But I would argue that Richard III... so we can't prove whether or not Richard III killed these children. What we know is that they were last seen of in the Tower of London, then they weren't seen of, and Richard III was king. So he may well have had these children have an accident and force himself to come to the throne.
It would have been in his best interest for exactly what happened.
But he might have done this because he would have seen what happened exactly to Henry III. Oh, sorry, not Henry III, Henry VI, where he, if not saw directly, know in living memory what happened when a minor ascends to the throne in a time of strife and conflict is disaster. And so perhaps he thought, unless I'm made king, the Yorkist cause will lose. And so he thought that perhaps the Yorkists needed a strong, clear leader that was able to lead and wouldn't be influenced unduly by corrupt and incompetent councillors. He probably would have been made protector of the realm, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he would be the most important person in power, as was the case with Henry V. As he left several important councillors for his son after he died, but they were constantly vying for power.
With the Tower of London, I know a little about it. At that point, was it definitely that was a prison?
It was a prison and a fortress
where they were incarcerated.
Most likely.
Okay.
Most likely, it was a prison, but also a fortress. So they could have been staying there for their own protection.
But also had nice apartments in it too. Like you could be incarcerated, but
They still have
pretty
nice
nice.
apartments there
Right.
now, actually.
Yeah.
It could have been either. I mean, the cynic will say, yeah, he killed the children to make himself king. But you can couch that with, in his mind, he basically saw there was an existential threat to the Yorkist dynasty, and in his mind, if they didn't have a strong, adult, capable leader of their dynasty and therefore holding the crown on his head, he thought that the Yorkist cause would definitely be undermined.
And when did he ascend to the throne? Like, when did the boys disappear, and when did he ascend?
I believe it was 1483. I will double check that for you.
So he did not have a long reign.
No, it was he was king from. Oh, I was right, 1483. Yes.
Okay.
So he was only king for 2 years.
Okay.
It's ironic that so many times there had been back and forth in the Wars of the Roses where the leader of whichever dynasty at the time being killed, and the next one would bugger off to France or Burgundy and come back. But at this point, Henry VII had no heirs. Richard III had no heirs because I believe his son had died. So although the Yorkists he had also the Lancastrian establishment had been pretty gutted by this point, and the Yorkists had very effectively sort of got a strong grip, not a complete dominance over England. There were plenty of lords upset with Richard and how he got to the throne and his treatment of other lords, which I'll come into later, which really was his undoing. But the Yorkists were in the strongest position they'd ever had by this point during the 100 Years' War. And I think the only reason why it was the final battle of the Wars of the Roses was because neither Richard nor Henry had an heir. So there was no one to bugger off to France when one of them died. So, in 1485, Henry VIII, or Henry VII, sorry, as he would be, at this point just Henry Tudor, sets off from the Low Countries and lands in western Wales.
What's, to an American, what is the Low Countries? What is that?
Low Countries is modern day Belgium and the Netherlands.
Okay.
Which, at this point, if you were to class it under a polity, would be Burgundy. But they were referred to as the Low Countries because literally they were very low and were flooded quite a lot of the time.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, that makes sense.
So Henry Tudor lands in southwestern Wales. He's from Wales originally, and this is basically his last hope. He knows that if he loses this campaign, the Lancastrian cause is finished. So he lands in Wales, and he starts marching up the coast. And a lord whose name escapes me, unfortunately, but an important Welsh March lord, who had basically been instructed by Richard III to guard against invasions there, almost did the same as what Marshal Ney did when Napoleon returned from Elba. Is he was sent there by the king to counter this invasion, and then sort of marched alongside Henry's forces in parallel, and then met him at Newport and was like, actually, I'm not a big fan of Richard III. Let's go take him on together. And so he did that. There was another major lord who mustered his forces just north of Liverpool, who was sent to go down south to try and counter the invasion, but it was sort of too late by the time he could have reached them, and Henry Tudor had mustered too many troops for this single lord to counter him himself. So Richard, learning of this, started to muster his forces from Nottingham, where I'm from actually, where I live, where Robin Hood's from, started to muster his forces there. And so the Yorkist allied lord from Liverpool moved towards Nottingham, and Richard moved towards Wales, and the Yorkist and Lancastrian forces met near Bosworth Market, just west of Leicester. So importantly, Lord Stanley, he was basically the linchpin for either side. He was a lord that had sort of been nominally allied to Richard III. He had supported him when he became king, but he didn't really like him because Richard III was quite a vociferous monarch. He was quite vengeful for those that he thought had fought against his cause previously in the wars. but he was also the king, and so Stanley knew if he just rebelled against him, he'd get executed. So what he basically did was, when the two armies met at Bosworth Field, Richard III's armies were divided into 3 companies, or battles as they were known, so 3 sections, on a hill. Interestingly, Richard was keen to have mass before this battle, but his priest was late, which delayed the start of the battle. They did the mass and then realised they didn't have any bread and wine, so they had to wait for that, which then delayed their start to the battle, allowing Henry Tudor to position his forces and sort of effectively rushing his own deployment of troops. So they were not as organised as they perhaps would have been, and not as prepared for battle as they perhaps would have been. Also, it's said that because of this, not many of the troops had breakfast, so a lot of them were fighting on an empty stomach, and Richard himself didn't really sleep much at all the night before.
Right.
He's portrayed as, by Shakespeare and in popular culture, as a hunchback, cripple. Sort of his famous portrait is him coveting his ring like this to look like a covetous, evil, conniving scoundrel. But actually, he was quite well known for his martial prowess, strength, and athleticism. In fact, one of his biggest criticisms of Henry Tudor was that he said Henry had not any real military experience and was not athletic enough to be king.
Interesting.
But anyway, so he positioned his army into 3 companies or battles, with himself leading the centre one, and 2 of his lords, or one each of his lords leading the vanguard on his right, and another lord leading the one on the left. He deployed a screen of archers, his forces, into 2 manoeuvre arms, the first of which began to advance on Richard's right flank. And so Richard's vanguard then went to meet him, and as they would, before they did, they were sort of a bit shocked about the fact that Henry's army did not really give a toss about the fact they were getting peppered by a cannonade.
And as far as the, wasn't this kind of battle, you mentioned cannons, and yet weren't there still armored knights and longbows?
Absolutely,
And
yeah.
then like musketeers or blunderbusses
Absolutely.
or something, so there was a lot of, this is a real transition.
Yeah, so there wouldn't be so many musketeers at this stage of history, but certainly cannons did exist.
Okay.
They wouldn't have been as sophisticated as the cannons you see in the 19th century, nor would the crews using them be as skilled as they would be. But cannons were very much a part of warfare at this point. They were instrumental in the siege of Harfleur in 1415. And yeah, they were a strong part of warfare. I can talk for another half hour about how the importance of cannon on the medieval battlefield encouraged centralisation and developed the path towards absolute monarchism. But that's a tangent.
That's a whole other podcast.
Yeah.
That's very good.
In one sentence, cannons were very expensive to make, use, and maintain, which meant that only a centralised bureaucracy could afford them. So a state had to centralise to have cannons, and then a lord by himself couldn't afford to make and use lots of cannons. So a centralised military force. Anyway.
That makes sense.
So Henry's vanguard advanced on Richard's right, ignoring the cannonade that was peppering them, much to Richard's dismay. And so Richard's vanguard then met him. Henry's troops did a lot better than was expected, bearing in mind they were outnumbered by a significant margin overall, although in this specific engagement it was only a third of Richard's forces that was engaging about half of Henry's. But Henry's troops started to do rather well. Lord Stanley then appears from the southeast. Richard's thinking, oh, fucking Christ, brilliant! We've won! We've outflanked Henry. I've got Stanley there. You know, this engagement is a bit, we're not sure, but, you know, with Stanley, and then my forces can wheel round and we've got him flanked. And then Stanley stands there and doesn't move. And Richard has an oh bugger moment when he realises that basically what Stanley's doing is, because he doesn't really like Richard and he thinks he could probably get himself quite a good position in any new government, he also doesn't hate Richard so much that he wants to risk being executed to rebel against him. So basically what Stanley's doing is he's sitting there and thinking, as soon as I see one of the sides is winning, then I'll come in and do the finishing blow, basically. And that's exactly what happens. So Henry, he takes the remainder of his army, or the remainder of his cavalry rather, to do a sort of northeasterly push across the battlefield towards the centre of Richard's line. Richard with his mounted knights, these are the heavily armoured, mounted gentlemen. Richard actually abandoned his heavy yet slow cavalry horse for a faster horse so that he could get there quicker. Richard and his cavalry charged to meet Henry's forces, and a brutal melee ensues. One of Richard's lieutenants had his legs rendered at the knee by an axe. Both Richard and Henry were demounted and they were fighting on foot. I think that they were both wearing rather bright uniforms, or uniforms, I suppose, signifying that Richard was the king and Henry was the leader of his army, which is perhaps why Richard so doggedly dashed for Henry, because he saw him personally, was like, right, I'm having him. And this melee was pretty unclear who was going to win to start with. Richard's lieutenants were on several occasions said to him, look, we can cover you and we'll hold them off while you retreat. Either go back to your line and we'll see what we can do, or you can retreat fully and go back to a castle and live to fight another day. But he said, no. He basically said, I'm going to fight until I die or I win. And that's exactly what he did. He was cut down and killed. But I actually get ahead of myself, because before he was killed, Stanley finally sees this melee. He sees that it's sort of going, oh, it's quite close, it could be either way, but he knows now that if he employs his forces, not only, so a third of Richard's army is still sitting on this hill. Another third is engaging and kind of losing to Henry's experienced troops on Henry's left flank. And so Stanley knows if he joins the battle now, encircles Richard and kills him, then the Lancastrians have won. So that's exactly what he did. And he envelops Richard's forces from the southeast, and Richard is eventually surrounded by Welsh spearmen and killed. And that's the end of the Yorkist cause. There is, after this point, no one, there were probably a few relatives, but there was no one willing or able to actually present a real claim for the Yorkist cause. And Henry was soon after made Henry VII. Importantly, though, he married a Yorkist woman, which was key to him securing his reign. And that was why the Wars of the Roses ended. Because as soon as he married, I believe her name was Margaret Beaufort, he combined the two houses. And that's why the Tudor rose is very different to the Lancastrian or Yorkist rose, because it's deliberately a combination of the two. And Henry VII then went on to be what is generally speaking, for the people of England and the lords in England, a very boring, very stable king who stayed out of wars and pored more over ledgers and accounting books than he did battle maps. And that was exactly what England needed at the end of the Wars of the Roses, because they had lost so many important nobles, so many men. And this is again after losing the 100 Years' War. So Henry VII was the perfect medicine with what England needed to unite and put these sort of grievances behind them and just, enjoy some peace for a time.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, so that's, Richard III, Shakespeare's Richard III, that's who he's talking about. Now, was Richard III a Plantagenet? Or did that end beforehand?
Yeah,
I'm
so
fuzzy on that.
So yeah, Richard III is a Plantagenet. Yeah, they were called Yorkists, but he was strongly enough connected to the Plantagenet line. There was an account of him in the battle where his helmet had been struck off him, and Henry sees him personally, and sees this monstrous, barbarous man consumed by anger, the embodiment of the final end of the Plantagenet dynasty. He certainly was, for Henry the Lancastrians, a Plantagenet.
Interesting. Okay. Very good.
Interestingly, about the reason why I think Richard III is given such a negative portrayal in Shakespeare is because he wrote the play after Henry became king. So he wasn't exactly going to give Richard III a glowing endorsement.
Right. So let's see, by then he would have been, Elizabeth was a Tudor, right? When
Elizabeth I, yes.
Right.
Absolutely a Tudor,
Okay.
yeah.
So then it was Stuart starting with James the First.
It was, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And when was Richard III written? Was that under a Tudor queen? I don't even know the date of it.
I don't know the date of it. I am actually, you are far much more of a Shakespearean than I. I will find out now for you, though. Written around 1592 to 1594.
Okay, so that would be early, and that would
that would be in the
solidly
Elizabethan era.
He would be writing about her grandpa. So,
absolutely.
So he would probably do well to make the other guy look bad.
Mm.
That makes sense. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you. That was fascinating. Another great lesson from across the pond. Appreciate that, and we'll have to do this again
Absolutely.
very soon. Thanks, Charlie.
No worries.